According to new polling out this week, nearly half of Americans think that harsh and violent political rhetoric was indeed to blame, at least in part, for the tragedy in Tucson, and more than half think it could easily cause a similar shooting in the future. In our third story, this puts a magnifying glass on the past rhetoric of several Republicans dipping their toes in the 2012 presidential pool. And if what we saw last night is any indication, it could take more than Sean Hannity to scrub the record. Respondents to the opinion research CNN poll were asked to assign degrees of blame to different factors leading up to the massacre. 35% thought Mrs. Palin's infamous target map was a factor. 44% did not. A lack of resources for mental health care was identified as a big culprit. 70% said so. Asked about the use of harsh rhetoric and violent metaphors by politicians and commentators leading up to Tucson, the number was essentially split, 48-49. But asked if harsh or violent discourse would, quote, cause a future incident similar to the shootings in Arizona, 54% said it was either very or somewhat likely. With those numbers as backdrop, today the man who once suggested the UN building in New York could lose its top 10 floors without anybody noticing has now suggested he could be the GOP's choice next year. The former ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, telling Russian television station RT America, quote, well, I think I could win the Republican nomination if I chose to run because I do think I'm in the mainstream of the Republican Party. I think Barack Obama is beatable in 2012. The mainstream Republican saying in 1994, quote, the Secretariat building in New York has 38 stories. If you lost 10 stories today, it wouldn't make a bit of difference. Then there's Governor Rick Perry of Texas, a state with a $27 billion budget deficit. The National Review cites political operatives in Austin who say, quote, Perry's campaign team has been quietly polling voters outside the Lone Star State to gauge his chances on the national stage. This is the same Rick Perry who told a crowd at a tax day Tea Party rally in 2009, quote, I'm just not real sure you're a bunch of right-wing extremists, but if you are, we're with you. Asked about the audience yelling at the governor to secede, Governor Perry left the option on the table. Quote, we've got a great union. There's absolutely no reason to dissolve it. But if Washington continues to thumb their nose at the American people, you know, who knows what might come out of that. And then there is Mrs. Palin, who told Sean Hannity last night that her aspirations for higher office still exist, just as does her misunderstanding of the use of the term blood libel.
Blood libel obviously means being falsely accused of having blood on your hands. And in this case, that's exactly what was going on. And yes, the historical knowledge that people have of the term blood libel, it goes back to the Jews who were falsely accused back in medieval European times of using the blood of children.
That woman is living in a fact-free environment. I'm trying. She was not accused of having blood on her hands. She was accused of using dangerous and irresponsible imagery and rhetoric to an audience for whom such talk can be almost like an addictive drug. Joining me now, David Frum, former speechwriter for George W. Bush, founder of FrumForum.com. Thank you for your time tonight, sir. It's good of you to be here.
Thank you.
Let me start with the big point here, which I would suspect is our common ground. As a former speechwriter, cause and effect of language is something you know better than I do. Does it surprise you that in this poll, in the CNN poll, that 54% of people suggested that another tragedy is plausible, is realistic if the rhetoric is not ratcheted down?
Well, I think people often try to communicate a deeper truth within the yes or no answer of a poll. Mm-hmm. That they want to say, we don't like this. And so since that's the way of conveying it, the problem with this kind of rhetoric is not its effect on crazy people who are lost in their own brain disease and who respond to those kinds of perspectives. The problem is its effect on normal people. And your clip of Governor Perry is a perfect example. Here's the governor of the second biggest state in the country, who is a very plausible Republican presidential nominee, who is trapped by things that he said at the behest of an angry crowd. Now, that doesn't reflect his real view. Mm-hmm. He has no interest in seceding from the Union. He would never contemplate it. But he is entrapped into saying those things, and others have been entrapped into saying other things, and that rhetoric will haunt them. It affects their future viability, and it affects the working of the political system here in Washington. You know, we're going to get through this repeal vote in the House of Representatives. That will be behind us, and then we'll have to do some real deal-making to advance Republican interests. How do you do that if you have convinced your own supporters that there's no compromise with this devil?
Right, and that brings us to our three examples, and Governor Perry is a good one. He chose to just sort of, nod his head gently to secession, as you pointed out, instead of saying, secession is insanity, economically and every other way, to say nothing of it being treason. But as you point out, you're kind of trapped by this and the environment in which you you flourish or your most ardent supporters exist, can any Republican let up on the tough talk, whether it is violent or nearly so, or is there some conviction that it's now become an essential sales tool?
Well, I hope I'm not imagining this, but I do feel in the air a kind of gear shift that's taken place in the last week, and partly in response to this terrible tragedy in Tucson, partly in response to the Republicans having a majority in the House of Representatives, being back in the game, partly because of the imminence of this health care vote, which leads you to begin to think what's on the other side of that vote. Newt Gingrich's reproach to Sarah Palin for speaking too harshly, I think, is a bellwether here. You may think what you want about the way Newt Gingrich speaks, but he's a very smart man, and he's very attuned to what's in the air. And I'm not a regular watcher of every episode of Glenn Beck, but my impression has been there's been a little bit more self-empowerment on that show recently and a little less paranoia. Also, if true, a straw in the air.
Does what Gingrich said, and his quote was, "Be more careful, and she should think through what she's saying," does that represent, do you think, any kind of consensus or building consensus among Republicans? Is it obviously, I would think you'd think it's good advice, or is there an element of it that's Mr. Gingrich trying to get some sort of edge on a possible rival? What's the most important consideration there?
Well, I do think that there is a lot of concern in senior levels of the Republican Party, and we've seen that now for some months, of people like, Ed Gillespie has now given an interview denying that he's had this view, so I don't want to attribute it to him if I'm being wrong, but that people in that kind of orbit are worried about the down-ballot effect of a Palin candidacy. 2012 is shaping up to be a very good year for Republicans in senatorial races. It may be a more difficult year at the top of the ticket. It may be in the Republican interest to have 2012 be a rather lower intensity year rather than a higher intensity year. If a lower intensity year, if you're going to lose the presidency anyway, but your more educated, older, more affluent voters are coming out as a bigger part of the electorate, then you can have even bigger gains in the Senate.
David Frum, former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, founder of Frum Forum, great thanks, and I hope your intuition on the toning down is absolutely correct, and I applaud any efforts you make to make sure that it is.
Thank you.